Hi, Craig Urquhart here, and welcome to Berlin Conversations. Today I'm very pleased to have my friend, conductor, pianist, and organist Alexander Frey joining me. So welcome, Alexander.
Thank you, Craig.
How are you today?
Oh, it's a beautiful summer day out here in Berlin. The weather is just perfect. The temperature is great, and being with you is even better.
It's great. We go back quite a few years, don't we? We met in the mid-'80s.
Yes, we were introduced to each other by Leonard Bernstein.
Of course.
Yeah.
That happened. Yeah, and we share the same alma mater.
The University of Michigan.
Yeah.
And that's where we met.
Mm-hmm.
Harry Kraut, Lenny's manager, called me and said, "We're on tour. Where can you meet up with us?" And it turns out they were going back to Ann Arbor. I wasn't living in Ann Arbor back then, but I came there, back to our roots, you and me. And there we were. We met each other there.
Yeah, great. And we've been friends ever since.
Ever since, in a variety of places.
And worked on many projects together,
Absolutely.
too. So you started out as a pianist. How old were you when you started piano, and why did you start piano?
Well, my mother was a great pianist.
Oh, that's great.
And I don't say that just because she's my mother. I say that really objectively. It was at a time, of course, when there were very few women who had international careers in music. People don't realize that. It wasn't until the 1980s, really, that women started exploding onto the international classical music scene. That's when you started seeing more of them in orchestras, and more of them were having big solo careers. But in the 60s and the 70s, for example, it's hard to believe that through those 2 decades, there were only 3 women pianists who had international careers. Gina Bachauer, the great Greek pianist, Alicia de la Rocha, who's always seemed to have been there, and Rosalind Turek, who also studied with my piano teacher. She's a Chicago.
Oh, I didn't know that. She was an incredible.
You knew her?
Bach. I didn't know her personally, but I loved her performances of Bach.
She was amazing.
And even in her old age, she was recording for Deutsche Grammophon.
Incredible. And so my mother practiced 6 hours a day through my whole childhood. And I remember hearing the Brahms concerti and Beethoven concerti and sonatas and Prokofiev and Ravel and Debussy and tons of Chopin and Bach and so forth. And so I grew up hearing the central canon of the piano repertoire in my own house. And my parents were passionate classical music lovers. My father, who was a lawyer, could listen to a recording and tell you whether it was Stravinsky or Schoenberg. That's how erudite he was. He was passionate about music. And my mother studied with Gavin Williamson, who was a legendary teacher and performer from the early half of the 20th century. He was born in the 19th century. And she would take me to her lessons every week since I was a baby. And I was 5 years old, and Gavin told me years later that he said, "You went up to the piano after one of your mother's lessons, and she just played a piece of Chopin. And he said, you had never touched the piano before. And you started poking out with your finger the tune of the piece of Chopin that she just played."
Wow, that's amazing.
And what's amazing, well, I think about it now, and what's incredible to me is that I was able, within just a few notes, to figure out the intervallic relationships. And Gavin looked to my mother and said, they were having coffee in the living room right next to the room where the 2 Steinways were. He said, "Wow, look at that. He's talented." And my mother said, "Well, should he begin piano now at the age of 5? And he said, "No. We're going to wait till he's 7 because the musculature and bones in the hands are not developed enough at the age of 5 to accommodate the piano repertoire." It was a very wise thing. I think if you're talented, it always will be there, whether you start at 4, 5, or 7. And so I began at 7. And
where did you practice if your mother was practicing 6 hours a day?
Well, then of course she acquiesced, but at 7 years old, of course, I was in school.
Yeah.
So by the time I would come home at the end of the day, she was all done, and then I would have my hours at the piano.
Okay. Yeah. And then when did you take up the organ?
Well, the same year that I started piano lessons at age 7. I began to sing as a boy treble in the men and boys choir of St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Evanston, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago.
Home of Northwestern.
Home of Northwestern University. And the organist choirmaster then was the great Czechoslovakian organ virtuoso Karel Paukert. And he was a great conductor too. And I remember the first time I heard him play on the very famous organ of the church, incredible, huge instrument. And it was like a huge wave just came and enveloped me. And I remember, to this day, age 7, saying out loud to myself, I want to do that. So I said to Gavin, can I also start organ lessons now? And he again made an incredibly wise decision in my life. He said, no. He said, you're going to study for 4 years intensely piano before you even touch the organ. And he said, however, I will give you certain, because he was also an organist, having studied in Paris and so forth. And he said, I will give you certain things about organ technique on the piano, which you can use. You'll be having beautiful legato, finger substitution, all that. And he did. And he said, because it'll make all the difference in the world if you have a solid piano technique before you start studying the organ. And he was absolutely right. And so at the age of 11, I started studying organ with the then relatively newer organist choirmaster of St. Luke's, Richard Webster, who's now at Trinity Church, Copley Square in Boston.
Oh, really? That's fabulous. Yeah. That's, my nephew got married.
It's a small world everywhere, every time you turn around.
Yeah, so that's interesting. And then you went to, when did you decide you wanted to start conducting?
Well, it's interesting.
Because they're different.
Well, I know, but I joke with my friends. They say, when did you start conducting? And I said, well, I conducted the Chicago Symphony and the New York Philharmonic and the Cleveland Orchestra and the Boston Symphony and the Philadelphia Orchestra when I was about 9 years old. They said, well, how did you do that? Oh, in my living room, of course. Exactly. Because my parents had this huge LP collection. As I said, they were both huge musical fans, as well as my mother being a pianist. And, I started reacting physically to the music. Even organ and piano music, not just, but then I would pretend I was conducting a symphony orchestra. It just took over me. And I had my first job as director of music at a church in Chicago when I was 14, and it was a pretty major church, and nobody could believe that they hired a 14-year-old, but I came in and I did a really excellent job, I have to say. And so it was my first experience conducting choirs. And I did this in church music for about good 25 years, non-stop.
You did it here in Berlin, too.
I did it here in Berlin at the Anglican Church when I first moved
St. George's.
St. George's. We've had you as our great soloist many times.
Thank you.
And playing your beautiful music.
Thank you.
And there was something in me that always wanted to be an orchestral conductor. And I had conducted our school orchestra when I was in high school and so forth, and junior high. We had very good orchestras. But then I got to the University of Michigan, and I thought, I came in as an organ major, and I chose Michigan because Robert Glasgow, the great organ professor, was there. I wanted to specifically study with him. And I got there, and I found out that Gustav Mahler was the great professor, and of course, one of the great conducting professors of the world, teachers. And
spent quite a few years at Tanglewood teaching.
Yes, he was the head of the department.
Right.
And
I know Bernstein had great respect for him.
Yeah, he did, absolutely did.
Because Lenny would come once a summer for a week or 2 weeks at Tanglewood and coach all of Gusti's students. Yeah.
Well, Gusti spent. He would prepare the students for the stars, for Lenny and Seiji and Kurt Masur and people like that. And I felt many times that he wasn't given really full credit for the hard work he put in to make sure that those students got up and there wasn't any real deficiency, that they were really prepared.
So, when you were studying conducting with Gustav Mahler, what does studying conducting mean? And because people think conductors, they're just up there waving their hands. We know better.
Yeah, in a few cases it's kind of like that.
Maybe, yeah.
Some of the bad conductors.
But I mean, how does one begin to study conducting?
Well, first of all, Gusti was very kind to take me in this class because I was an organ major, and that was at the time when Michigan did not allow a double major.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, I would have been doing both. But I auditioned for Gustav, and he said, I really want you in my class. And he said, so I'll tell you what, I will enroll you. You will take all of the classes that my conducting majors take. And you will just simply, you'll be an organ major, but you'll have intensive studies in orchestral conducting.
Mm-hmm. Well, they sort of go together too, because an organ is an orchestral instrument.
I always think of the organ as an orchestra with keyboards.
Right, yeah.
Now you might say, well, what about the organs of the 18th
No.
century? And I said, well, it's a different kind of orchestra. Same
Mhm.
thing, an orchestra with keyboards, but a different kind of orchestra. But yes, we think of the great symphonic possibilities in the
Mhm.
organ. So it was natural, and having done church choirs and everything. But orchestral conducting was very different. Now you asked about what is it like to study conducting. It is very complex. First of all, the traditions that you inherit from your conducting teacher. And Gustav Mayer's tradition goes to Richard Strauss and goes farther than that to Richter and so forth, because he was in the class in Vienna, and then he worked at the Opera House in Zurich after that. And so it's kind of like the sorcerer passing on the magic to the apprentice. And first of all, you have to learn the basics, of course, beating time, beating the different meters. You have to learn how to read a score. You have to learn what the transpositions of every instrument. You have to learn the playing techniques of every instrument and what special things are idiomatic for each one. And then you have to be able to read all of this. I mean, this is just the basics. And then after that, you have to learn how to transmit. I mean, the word conductor, when you think of it in terms of electricity, you'd flip the switch, the power goes through this thing, the conductor, and it sends it to the whatever machine it's hooked up to, whether it's a blender or a light, let's say a light, and the light bulb goes on. So the conductor, you take the energy of the score, the music, it goes through you, and you transmit that energy to the instrumentalists in front of you or the singers, and they transmit it to the audience. And some people are really born with this possibility, where they just, something in their personality, and there's just something about the power of music, and they have this innate, intuitive way of inspiring to the orchestra. I think that's in many ways, that's the most important result of all of this knowledge, is that you inspire the orchestra to play better than they normally would, to bring out the best in them, in other words. And not everybody can do that. You can go through all the thing and you can correct a note and correct a rhythm and change the balance, but to make them play with that thing that makes you go in your seat as a listener, that's a very special thing. But you have to have all the basic knowledge. And then there's the extra musical knowledge. Let's say you're conducting a piece of Liszt. Let's say Debussy, because I'm working on something in Debussy right now. So you learn the music that Debussy wrote around the same time that he wrote the piece you're working on. And then you listen to his music of his contemporaries to see what his influences were. What world premieres, not just the French music, but any music, took place in Debussy's life in Paris around the time he wrote this music. And then you look at the art of the period, you read some of the great French literature of the period, see what's going on historically. And you immerse yourself into this world of the composer. And all of this comes to play when you lift that stick and you go, boom.
Yeah. So you've conducted all over the world, right?
50? 51 countries,
Yeah.
5 continents.
Okay, we got to get you to Antarctica.
yes. You're like the polar bear orchestra there.
So, yeah. So what repertoire do you do? You do all of it, right?
Well, of course I do the central canon of the orchestral repertoire. Most of it is European music. But I've also done a lot of American music. And I've also done some music by Asian composers when I've conducted in Asia, for example. And I'd also do a lot of musical theater because I've always been in love with the great tradition of Broadway. And I've also done opera. In fact, I leave, now that things are opening up again, I leave in a few weeks for Italy to conduct an orchestra concert and then 2 performances of Puccini's Gianni Schicchi.
Oh, wonderful.
At the big musical festival in Abruzzo. And so I do opera and Broadway and symphonic repertoire and a lot of Hollywood film music. I've done a lot of regional premieres, believe it or not, of pieces of Vertigo, Bernard Herrmann, the first Latin American performance of Vertigo, and Waxman's Jekyll and Hyde, and An Affair to Remember, and Gone with the Wind, and a lot of the Korngold scores too.
Did you get into that through your relationship with your professional relationship with John Mauceri, or were you into film music?
No, I wasn't. I didn't know a lot about film music, and then I became acquainted with John Mauceri, who's a dear friend of ours.
Yeah, and he was the music director of the Hollywood Bowl.
Of the Hollywood Bowl Orchestra for 16 years. Yeah. And really, I think he's the world's greatest conductor of film music.
Well, he's really the one that championed it and put it on the map.
He really brought it back to the public big time, the whole canon of film music, and has lectured on it and written books and articles on it. Incredible. And so he showed me how actually the sound of Broadway is the same sound of Hollywood, because it was the orchestrators in the 30s on Broadway were the Viennese composers who ended up fleeing the Nazis and ended up on Broadway, and of course ended up also in Hollywood, like Korngold and Waxman, and had this incredible European sound. And I became just thrilled, and I did a lot of research. I began to know the families of those composers. I'm very close with the Korngold family, and John Waxman, the son of Franz Waxman, is a good friend of mine, and Juliet Rosa, the daughter of Miklos Rosa, and the former widow, late widow, of Alex North, Anna North, became a very close friend of mine. And so they told me the stories of these great men. And then Tony Thomas, who was the great historian, became a really good friend of mine. Then David Raxon, who wrote Laura and Carrie, and just a whole slew of Forever Amber, of great films, became a very close friend and supporter of my work. And before he died, he gave me some manuscripts of things that he wrote. And he said, this would be a great organ transcription. And he gave me a piece that he wrote for organ and orchestra that was only played once, a beautiful work, and I own it. And he gave me it's the only existing manuscript.
Well, you should have it digitized.
Yes, I want to do that. I'd love to play it somewhere.
Yeah.
So anyway, but I feel, and I've worked with Howard Shore and Alan Silvestri and Danny Elfman. I've done concerts of their music with them in the audience.
So that's a very interesting thing. I know you did concerts in Vienna during
a lot of them
of film music,
and the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra with John conducting. Yeah, and in fact, John and I and Sandra Tomic, who's the director of the Hollywood and Vienna Festival, we came up with the idea one night in the restaurant at the Marriott Hotel in Leipzig while we were rehearsing and getting ready to do these concerts.
And it makes perfect sense.
Yes.
It's a great idea.
We turned it to Vienna.
Yeah. And so in terms of organ repertoire, you played in great churches and cathedrals throughout the world, and you do major works. You do Mahler Symphony.
Well,
what else? I mean,
I have to say I'm the first person to have ever played an entire Mahler Symphony as a solo organ work, and that was in the early '80s. I did the Mahler Fifth Symphony, and then years later I did it in Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. And when I first started doing this, do you know that I was laughed at? I would tell my professional organist colleagues, "Oh, I'm going to do the Mahler Fifth Symphony." They go, "Oh, come on, it's ridiculous. What rubbish. What rubbish."
What, the symphony or the idea?
Both.
Really? Okay.
I was stunned. Well, I can't separate the two. You know, the idea, yes, but it's the piece. No matter what it's done, whether it's an organ work or with some of the orchestra, it's the piece. And the first time I ever did it, I made a big announcement, and I remember walking to the console to play the piece, and I looked out in the audience, there was hardly anybody there. Friends of mine, family, but no organist, maybe just one or two. I was stunned. Then, because transcriptions were poo-pooed, and I was playing them as a teenager. And then years later, in, was it 1998, I think, I did it at Grace Cathedral, and the place was packed. Because at this point, transcriptions had come back into favor. And as I said to Michael Barone, who is the host of Pipe Dreams, which is a show about the organ on Minnesota Public Radio, broadcast throughout the country. He said, he introduced me to a group once, saying, first organist to ever play a Mahler Symphony as a solo organ work. And I said, and not only that, I'm the only organist, not only to have first played a Mahler Symphony solo as a solo organ work, but also to have conducted Mahler Symphonies. So, anyway, so it's a multifaceted world in my case.
Yeah, and you also, I remember you also played the harpsichord.
Yeah, I've done...
Did you ever finish that project of the Fitzwilliam?
Well, we never...
You were going to do...
We were going to do it, we were all set to do it, and what happened was our dear friend Susan Del Giorno, Koch International Classics went out of business. It was bought up by E1, which has been very nice. The company's been very nice to me. In terms of, I still get royalties from my recordings from them, but they don't really do classical music anymore. I'd like to do it, and I actually have the place to do it. It's on the top of a mountain near Rome, in a concert hall which has 3 or 4 fabulous harpsichords. I perform there every year. But we did other things, in the process. The complete piano works of Bernstein.
Right,
For which you wrote the booklet.
Yes. And it's one of the best recordings of Bernstein's piano.
Yes, I think so. And
you also worked on Bernstein's Peter Pan.
Oh, that's a very interesting project because, and you had a lot to do with that. And the people in the Bernstein office, Marie Carter, Garth Sutherland, they were such a huge help. And what happened was, here in Berlin, Humphrey Burton's book had just come out. And
Humphrey Burton's
biography of Leonard Bernstein. And I had read in it, when he was talking about Peter Pan, that there was a song called Dream With Me, which had been cut in the original production in 1950. For those who don't know, Leonard Bernstein wrote a version of Peter Pan in 1950. Which
he wrote incidental music.
Yeah, incidental music. That's what we thought. It starred Jean Arthur as Peter Pan and Boris Karloff as Captain Hook. And I was stunned because I knew the song Dream With Me, and I was stunned that it was cut. I couldn't believe it. And I got a hold of the original cast album, and this was another mystery. There were 4 songs of Bernstein, and the rest of the music was composed by Alec Wilder. And I couldn't figure that out. It was the same conundrum as the film On the Town.
Yeah, right.
Which there was another composer brought in to write 75% of the music, really.
And all of that is garbage. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's so it's okay, but it's
not Bernstein.
No, it's day and night. So and Alec Wilder was a wonderful theater composer, but it just didn't go together at all. So I called Susan Del Giorno actually the same day that I read this. It was an aha moment. And she was the general manager of Koch International Classics, which was at the time the 4th largest label of classical music. A lot of people don't know that, but it was. And I said, I have this idea. I want to find out if there was other music written for this show and put it together. And if there's enough, we should record it. And she saw the value of this idea. And she said, keep me in the loop. And then I called you.
Mm-hmm.
And you said, well, you need to talk to Marie and Garth in the office.
Mm-hmm.
And so I flew to New York a couple months later. And from that time, which was I think 98 or 99, 98, until we recorded it, there was a span of 7 years, 6.5. And because my schedule was very full, of course. And so whenever I was free, I would fly to New York and I would look at new materials, and certain things were found in folders by chance even, and gradually all this music seemed to appear. Some of it was in the original orchestrations. There was a lot of music that was cut or just wasn't even considered. And it turns out there was almost an hour of never before heard Leonard Bernstein music. Astounding. And it was glorious. There were more songs. And even the songs that were done in 1950, parts of those songs were cut.
Mm-hmm.
For example, Build My House is 55 seconds long on the original cast recording. By the time I found all the rest of the music and put it together, it was 6.5 minutes. I mean, that's just astounding. And it took me a long time, but we worked very, very hard on it, and we made the world premiere recording of the complete score.
Mm-hmm.
I did the first performances of the complete score in Lisbon, actually in Cascais, a suburb, right on the sea in a beautiful park. 3 performances in a weekend for a combined audience of almost 12,000 people. And then the world premiere stage production, Santa Barbara Theater, which I did for 2 seasons actually.
Right.
I've done about 40, 45 performances of it, and I know every note like it was engraved in my heart.
Well, I know the Bernsteins are very happy about the work that was done on it, and it is a great score, and I've heard it done with teenagers, and it's just, they did it in Bamberg, and it was just amazing.
And
It's fun. It's a great.
The story, of course, is timeless, the Barry story, but seeing people's reactions, old and young, to it. And at the premiere in Santa Barbara, the first year we did it, a member of the original cast from 1950 was there.
They do turn up, don't they?
Yes, the woman who played Tiger Lily came, and she was beautiful. And a beautiful person, and she, even though she must have been in her 80s, but she just had this youthfulness about her. It was like, being with Rita Moreno or something.
Mm-hmm.
There's always something, you always feel like you're talking to a 30-year-old in a sense, And she told me a lot about the original production, which filled in some gaps, actually. It was a great experience.
Yeah, it was,
And now I'm music director for the second time of a big production of West Side Story.
Right, in Bulgaria.
Varna, Bulgaria, at the Opera House. They were my second season. And for 4 years I did it in Prague, in Czech.
I know, I came to see that production.
Oh, you did? In Prague?
Remember we went? You were at the theater.
The Carlin.
Carlin, yeah.
You were there? I can't remember.
I came to that, yeah.
How about that? Wow.
Yeah.
How many countries have we been together?
Oh God, who knows? Yeah, so you live here in Berlin now, and you've lived here for quite some time.
Yes.
How many years now?
This will be my 30th.
Wow.
Coming right up.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, I just want to say one thing. You mentioned just quickly a back return to organ repertoire. I do Korngold film scores and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I do a lot of transcriptions, but I do almost the complete works of Bach and the complete works of Liszt and Franck and so forth.
Yeah.
So I just love the organ.
Yeah, well, you love music. So
Yeah.
That's what makes it so much fun.
Very sweet. Thank you.
Yeah, so you live here in Berlin now for 30 years.
Yes.
And why did you end up here?
I always wanted to live in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
It had been a life dream of mine. I'd been here for 2 summers as a child, first to Greece and then to Central Europe with my parents. And and here I was. I graduated. I was at the time the assistant organist of the Episcopal Cathedral in Chicago, St. James Cathedral. I prayed to go. I just was dying to leave and go to Europe, because that's where all the great traditions were in different cultures. I came from a European household. My mother is Greek. My father's family is French. So I read in the Chicago newsletter of the newsletter of the Chicago chapter of the American Guild of Organists that there was a job open in a Berlin church as organist and choir director as a 1-year sabbatical replacement while their music director was going to take a year of absence, a year leave of absence. And so I applied for the job and I got it. And I came here, it was in Tegel, in the north of Berlin, and it came with her apartment.
Oh, nice.
Oh, yes, it was beautiful. And back then, Tegel still is like this in a sense, but there was all these pockets around Berlin had a feeling of being in a village.
Yeah, well, still.
It does, but Berlin was a quieter city back then.
Yeah.
And of course, the Allied forces were here, and I arrived I arrived the day before the reunification, October 2nd, 1990. So for my first full day here, East Germany still existed officially. The next day, it was gone. And that was incredible because the wall had been opened up 10 months before. And this is a discrepancy. The wall did not come down 10 months earlier. It was opened up. It took them a long time to tear down all of that wall.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And so it was still standing in many places when I first moved here. I saw them ripping chunks of it down, but it was still standing, and I saw the guard towers. And West Berlin was this incredible, crazy island. Very creative.
I loved it in the 80s.
Yeah, very crazy. And on the weekends, it was wild because the soldiers would come in and did the discos and everything. It was just incredible. And then when you went to the east, it was very quiet. The chic areas we know now, like Prenzlauer Berg and Friedrichshain around Samariterstrasse, the buildings were in ruins.
Mm-hmm.
And there were apartments being taken over by squatters. It was just unbelievable.
Piles of coal in the street.
Yes, yes. And the buildings, even the famous ones like the Berliner Dome and the Reichstag, still had bullet holes.
Yeah.
The Berliner Dome was reeked with pockmarks from mortars and bullets. So what people see now, you would be shocked to have seen it back then.
Well, I mean, Potsdamer Platz, as we all know, didn't even exist.
I remember when they were building it.
It was nothing.
It was a field.
Yeah.
And do you remember when you would go, and this is still the way in the first few years of the 90s, when you would go, for example, to Friedrichstrasse, which now you see all the Galerie Lafayette, all these wonderful buildings and everything, it looks beautiful. It was dark. And those buildings didn't exist.
They didn't exist.
They were communist, they were falling apart. And of course, because the East Germans' lives were suddenly thrust into this incredible vortex of a world they had heard about but were told was not the world they ever wanted to see, was upon them, the world of the West. And some people adjusted very quickly, just jumped in it with both feet, and other people were really spooked about it.
And I know from personal experience.
Me too. I had conversations with both kinds. Oh, wow.
So, and then you started working at the Berliner Ensemble, and then you sort of really established yourself.
Yes, well, what's interesting is after my first year as a church musician, the director of music of this congregation came back as planned, and I thought, well, what do I do next? And because I planned to stay, I already had a visa. And a friend of mine who played in the Boston Symphony said to me, I have a friend who's the assistant to the artistic director of Theater des Westens.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes.
The artistic director at the time was the great Helmut Baumann.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know that name?
No.
He was he directed Lucas Voll and all the great Broadway shows that they used to do from the classic repertoire. Mm-hmm. And he starred in Lucas Voll as well.
Okay.
Yes, that was fantastic. He was a great actor, great director. He's still active, but now up in the north of Germany. So the woman's name was Margit Weber, and I went to her office, and I said, our mutual friend. So she said, oh, I know all about you. He already called me. He said, well, listen. I said, well, if you ever need a pianist, I wasn't even thinking conducting. Mm-hmm. And she said, well, give me your name and number. And turns out, a few weeks later, she called me, and she said, we have a new musical called The Blue Angel, based on the Marlene Dietrich film, and we need a pianist for the auditions. So they engaged me, and for 3 days in a completely darkened Delphi theater, I played starting at 10 in the morning till midnight, because everybody came to audition for this show, for all the auditions. And then after that I was hired to be pianist for the rehearsals, and I became assistant conductor. And eventually that led, because the stage director for that, Theater des Westens, was Peter Zadek, and he became the intendant of the Berliner Ensemble, and he invited me to come there, and then I became the music director of that theater.
Mm-hmm. So you really contributed a lot to the Berlin cultural life.
I did. I was there for 4 years at the Berliner Ensemble, and I did about 7 or 8 productions during those 4 years. And of course, because it's a repertoire theater, I first started with 1 production, and so I had 1 or 2 performances a week of that, and then came the second, and I was at the theater more. And then after, when they're all running at the same time, I practically lived there. And of course, the great tradition, it was where Kurt Weill was one of my predecessors in the job, and where Three Penny Opera and Happy End, all these great collaborations with Bertolt Brecht, who founded the theater, occurred. And Hans Eisler was the music director, Paul Dessau, so I was following this incredible tradition. So I really grew up in the German theater tradition, and Peter Zadek was one of the most famous directors of the 20th century, and I sat next to him for, actually even during Blue Angel, so for 5 years. I learned a lot from him. Mm-hmm. And then after that, I had my first orchestral music directorship. I went from the Berliner Ensemble to become music director, really right afterwards, of the Roman Philharmonic in Italy.
I remember all this time.
For 8 years, yeah.
So, and Berlin, you just love living.
Oh gosh, I adore the city. I'm in love with it. I've had a long love affair with it, and I think
it's been good to you.
It's been very, very good to me, beyond good to me.
Yeah.
And actually, I meet people who move here, who've moved here in the recent years, and occasionally I come across somebody who says, I say, well, what do you hope to do here? And they say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to change the city, I'm going to make an impact, I'm going to blah, 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 blah. And you know what I say to them? I say, you know something? Everything you've just said has been done here before.
Right.
I said, everything creatively has already been done here. That's the magical thing about the city. And I said, you're not going to teach us anything. I said, however, your life will be enhanced incredibly and exponentially in the most beautiful way if you let Berlin teach you.
Wonderfully said, yes.
Yes, and that's the difference. I always let Berlin teach me.
Well, I can't say it any better.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for coming and sharing everything you just did with me, and to talk about your incredible talent.
Oh, you're very sweet. Thank you.
And I do hope to have you back.
Anytime.
And just thanks so much, Alex. And it's always great to see you and to call you a friend, and a musical friend, and a personal friend. And
you're very dear to me always.
Yeah, so it's just really great. So thanks so much for stopping by.
And I am so glad that you now live among us full time.
Oh, I am too. I don't miss New York at all.
Neither do I. And we actually lived close to each other.
Yeah.
In 2003, I lived in the Chelsea Hotel.
Yeah.
And you were just
down the street.
Down the street.
Yeah. Berlin's. I started coming here in the early '80s. It was my love affair at first sight too.
What brought you first here?
My dear friend John Dawson.
I love
him. He got his job at the Deutsche.
I miss him terribly.
I do too. And I got on a bicycle, and I never got lost. Because you always run into a wall.
Yeah. So you were here in the early '80s.
Yeah.
If we just had a minute, what was that like? Because for you who had just arrived,
It was fascinating. I just loved Berlin from the day I arrived. And of course, as an American, I could go back and forth.
Yes.
And when I would come to visit John, we'd go and hear our friend Roberta Alexander, who would often sing at the Komische Oper in the East.
Roberta Alexander?
Yeah, Roberta.
Yes,
yeah.
Sure.
And so we'd go, and we as Americans, we could take the train to Friedrichstrasse. We didn't always have to go through Checkpoint Charlie.
But you were controlled when you got
there. Oh, we were controlled, yes. Yeah. It was the scariest intimidating thing, but it was fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Berlin was interesting, and it was still in a post-war kind of mentality, as you know, because it was occupied by the Allies, and a lot of Berlin was still not even near being rebuilt. And I remember going to restaurants in Hinterhofs where there's no wall.
Yes.
Like,
but you see, I remember the times since I had moved here that I would visit you in your apartment in New York, beautiful place, London Terrace, and then when you would come here and stay here for a few months. What I always found interesting is I think there must have been something about Berlin that inspired you as a composer, because this is what would happen. You would come here and stay for a few months, and then you would go to New York, and out would come this great new work for piano, a whole suite of pieces. And I always noticed it always happens right after he returns after being here.
Really? I didn't think of that.
Yeah, I thought about that just the other day.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
Yes. And now you're here, and you don't have to go back.
No, it's nice. Yeah.
Yes, everything is here.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you. And thanks again for stopping by.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining me for another Berlin Conversations with the multi-talented Alexander Frey, pianist, organist, and conductor, who lives here in Berlin and contributes to the musical and cultural life of this city. And so I look forward to seeing you in my next Berlin Conversation, and be sure you like this and share it with as many people as you feel free to. So thanks so much, and see you next time.
Bye-bye.